picture this. You're walking through a park with your kids, right? Beautiful day, everything's peaceful, and then bam, you see swastikas spray painted on the playground.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? And sadly, it's becoming all too real for many Jewish Canadians.
We're talking about a surge in anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And not just like online trolling, but actual in-person threats and violence.
Yeah, and it seems like things have really escalated after the Hamas attacks back in October.
October 7th, 2023, to be exact.
Yeah, that's the date that really sticks out. And, I mean, the sources we've been looking at, they all point to a dramatic increase in anti-Semitic incidents since then.
Dramatic. How dramatic are we talking?
Well, one source mentions a 670% increase.
Ooh, okay, 670%. That's not just a jump. That's like a full-on leap.
Exactly, and that's across Canada, not just in one particular region.
So what's going on? What's fueling this wave of hate?
Well, it's complex, obviously no single answer, but one of the things we're looking at in this deep dive is the role of government policies, particularly those implemented since Trudeau came to power back in 2015.
Okay, so Trudeau, right, he's often talked about Canada as a post-national state, right? A mosaic of cultures all living together in harmony.
Right, and his policies on immigration, for example, they've definitely contributed to a more diverse Canada.
Which is generally seen as a good thing, right? I mean, Canada prides itself on being multicultural.
Absolutely. Diversity is a strength, and these sources acknowledge that, but they also raise some concerns about potential unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences, like what?
Well, when you have a rapid influx of people from regions where anti-Semitic views might be more common,
I see where you're going with this.
and you don't have adequate integration efforts in place.
Then you risk importing those prejudices without providing the tools to challenge them.
Exactly. And so while diversity is a wonderful goal, it needs to go hand in hand with the strong commitment to fostering understanding and shared values.
Makes sense. So how does this tie back into the surge of anti-Semitism we're seeing?
Well, the sources we're looking at paint a pretty disturbing picture. We're not just talking about hateful comments online. We're talking about real-world incidents that are leaving Jewish communities feeling vulnerable and afraid.
Can you give us some examples? Like, what kinds of things are we talking about here?
Sure. I mean, there are reports of drive-by shootings targeting Jewish schools, synagogues being vandalized, some even firebombed,
Oh my God, that's horrifying.
and Jewish professors feeling intimidated on university campuses.
It's like a climate of fear has descended.
One source, Robert Krell, he's a Holocaust educator, he talks about witnessing these disturbing celebrations in Canada after the Hamas attacks.
Celebration? You mean people were actually celebrating the attacks?
Yeah, and he describes it as almost more shocking than the attacks themselves. It was like this sudden outpouring of anti-Jewish sentiment, almost as if a dam had burst.
Wow, that's a powerful image and deeply disturbing.
And this feeling that the attacks somehow legitimized pre-existing prejudices, it's something that comes up again and again in the sources.
It's like they provided an excuse to unleash this hatred that was already simmering beneath the surface.
And the statistics are pretty stark, too. You know, Jews make up less than 1% of the Canadian population.
Right, tiny percentage.
Yet they're the target of 70% of religiously motivated hate crimes.
70%. That's mind-blowing.
So clearly something isn't adding up here. And that's why we need to dig deeper and examine whether certain policies might be unintentionally contributing to this problem.
Okay, so let's start unpacking that. You mentioned Trudeau's immigration policies. How have those played into this?
Well, take the Syrian refugee program, for example. A lot of people came to Canada fleeing a terrible situation, and that was a humanitarian gesture, for sure.
Right, absolutely.
But some critics argue that without proper integration efforts, it might have inadvertently contributed to the rise in anti-Semitic incidents.
Because those refugees were coming from a region with a history of anti-Semitism.
Exactly. And one of our sources, Casey Babb, he's a national security expert, he warns against this naive assumption that biases just disappear when people come to a new country.
So just welcoming people with open arms isn't enough.
It's a good start, but you need to actively work to bridge those cultural divides and promote shared values.
So it's like bringing in seeds of intolerance without planting enough seeds of understanding to counter them.
That's a great way to put it. And it's something that we need to be more mindful of as a society, because if we're not proactive about fostering understanding and inclusion,
Then we risk creating a climate where these seeds of intolerance can take root and flourish.
exactly. And that's what we're seeing happening right now. And it's a trend that we need to reverse.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about immigration. What other policy areas are raising concerns?
Well, government funding is another big one. There have been some controversial decisions where federal funds were given to organizations or individuals with questionable ties or a history of making anti-Semitic statements.
The Laith Marouf case immediately comes to mind.
Right. He was given a pretty substantial grant for anti-racism work, despite having a long track record of making really offensive anti-Semitic remarks online.
Yeah. And that sparked a lot of outrage, right? People were furious.
Yeah, and it really eroded public trust in the government's ability to vet funding recipients properly. It's like they're sending mixed messages.
On one hand, promoting diversity and tolerance, but on the other hand, funding individuals who spread hatred.
And this kind of inconsistency, it fuels the perception that the government isn't taking anti-Semitism seriously enough as a distinct and urgent problem.
And it makes people question whether they're actually committed to combating it or whether they're just paying lip service to the issue.
Exactly, and that's a concern that comes up repeatedly in the sources we've been examining.
Okay, so we've got immigration and funding. What about Trudeau's foreign policy? Has that played a role as well?
Some critics say yes, particularly his stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict. There have been some moves that have been perceived as a shift away from Canada's traditionally strong alliance with Israel.
Like what specifically?
Well, in 2024, Canada imposed an arms embargo on Israel. They even blocked a U.S. ammunition shipment.
Whoa, okay, that's a pretty big deal.
And they also supported a UN ceasefire resolution that was seen by many as unfairly critical of Israel.
So these actions, they haven't gone unnoticed by those with anti-Israel sentiments within Canada.
Right, and some critics argue that these moves have actually emboldened those who hold anti-Israel views.
Potentially creating a climate where anti-Semitism is more readily tolerated or even excused.
Exactly, and so we're seeing this kind of interplay between domestic and international politics.
Where decisions made on the world stage can have a ripple effect back home.
And it's important to remember that anti-Israel sentiment can easily bleed into anti-Semitism.
It's like normalizing hostility towards Israel can make it easier for anti-Jewish prejudices to take root and flourish.
Precisely, and that's a danger that we need to be very aware of.
Okay, so we've got this complex web of factors at play here. Immigration, funding, foreign policy, all potentially contributing to this alarming rise in anti-Semitism, and we're back to that 670% increase.
Right, it's a perfect storm of sorts, and it underscores the urgent need to address this issue before it escalates further and causes irreparable damage to the fabric of Canadian society.
Absolutely. This is a critical moment,
Yeah.
and we need to have these difficult conversations and explore potential solutions.
Because this isn't just about statistics or policies, it's about the kind of society we want to live in. A society where everyone feels safe and respected, regardless of their background or beliefs.
Well said, and that's a conversation that we're going to continue in the next part of this deep dive, so stay tuned, folks.
And it's not just about overt acts of hatred, it's also about this kind of creeping normalization of anti-Semitism in certain spaces.
Normalization, what do you mean by that?
It's almost like it's becoming more acceptable to express anti-Jewish views, or at least to turn a blind eye to them.
And how is that happening? Like, how is this normalization taking place?
Well, one of the things we see in the sources is this tendency to disguise anti-Semitism as something else, something more palatable or even progressive.
Okay, that's interesting. Can you give us an example?
Sure, take this whole anti-Palestinian racism framework that's gaining traction.
Anti-Palestinian racism. I've heard that term being thrown around, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
Yeah, it's kind of a loaded term, right? Because on the surface, it sounds like it's about opposing discrimination against Palestinians.
Which is a worthy goal, right?
Absolutely. But the way this framework is often applied, it creates this false dichotomy where any support for Israel's existence is automatically labeled as racist.
So even just saying that Israel has a right to exist is considered racist under this framework.
In some cases, yes, and that's where things get really problematic because it shuts down any nuanced discussion about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And it makes it almost impossible to criticize Palestinian leadership or actions without being accused of racism.
Right, and that's the danger of this kind of black and white thinking. It shuts down dialogue and creates a climate of fear where people are afraid to speak their minds.
So instead of confronting anti-Semitism directly, it gets swept under the rug of this broader, more ambiguous label.
Exactly, and that makes it even harder to call out and combat anti-Jewish hatred because it's often masked as something else.
So it's like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
And it's not just limited to fringe groups either.
Yeah.
We're seeing this framework being adopted by some student unions, academics, even government officials.
Really? Wow, that's concerning.
It's gaining a foothold in mainstream discourse, and that's what makes it so insidious because it normalizes this dangerous ideology.
And it makes it really difficult to push back against because how can you criticize a movement that claims to fight racism even if it's being used to silence pro-Israel voices.
Exactly. It creates this real dilemma, and the sources we've been looking at, they highlight several instances where individuals have been ostracized, penalized, even fired for expressing views deemed pro-Israel, or for simply questioning this APR framework.
It's like they're trying to control the narrative by shutting down any dissenting voices.
And that kind of silencing, it's not just happening in government or political spheres, it's also happening on university campuses.
You mentioned earlier that Jewish professors are feeling intimidated on campus. Is that connected to this APR framework?
Absolutely. When you have student unions issuing statements supporting Hamas and professors equating Zionism with white supremacy, it creates an environment where anti-Jewish hatred is given space to thrive.
It's like they've created these echo chambers where extreme views are not only tolerated but celebrated while moderate voices are silenced.
And the sources we've examined, they reveal this deep sense of frustration and even betrayal within the Jewish community.
Like they feel like their concerns are being dismissed, ignored, or even silenced.
Exactly. And that's compounded by this tendency to conflate anti-Semitism with Islamophobia as if they're equivalent issues.
Right, it's like they're trying to minimize the very real and unique threat of anti-Semitism by lumping it in with other forms of bigotry.
And while all forms of hate are obviously bad, it's important to recognize that they have different historical roots and manifestations.
So just lumping them all together, it actually does a disservice to both issues.
Because it dilutes the seriousness of each one, and it prevents us from having those nuanced conversations that are necessary to address them effectively.
So it's not about playing oppression Olympics or anything like that. It's about recognizing that each form of hate requires a tailored approach.
Exactly. And the sources we've been looking at, they really underscore the need for a more nuanced and targeted approach to combating anti-Semitism specifically.
Okay, so we've got this whole APR framework that's being used to silence pro-Israel voices. We've got this conflation of anti-Semitism with other forms of bigotry. And we've got this general sense that the government isn't taking anti-Semitism seriously enough as a distinct and urgent problem. Is that a fair summary?
I think so, yeah. And I think it's also worth noting that this perception of government inaction is further compounded by Trudeau's actions on the international stage.
Right. The arms embargo on Israel blocking the U.S. ammunition shipment, those decisions, they send a strong message, whether it was intended or not.
It signals a shift in Canada's stance towards Israel, and some critics argue that it aligns with this broader global trend of growing anti-Israel sentiment.
Which, as we've discussed, can easily bleed into anti-Semitism domestically.
Exactly. It's like creating a climate where hostility towards Israel is normalized, and that can make it easier for anti-Jewish prejudices to take root and flourish.
And it all feeds into this feeling that Jewish Canadians are being abandoned by their own government.
That their safety and security are being sacrificed for political expediency.
So we've got this perfect storm brewing. A surge in immigration without sufficient integration efforts. Funding decisions that appear to support organizations with questionable ties. A foreign policy shift that's emboldening anti-Israel sentiment. A climate of fear on university campuses where anti-Zionist rhetoric is often equated with anti-Semitism. And this dangerous new ideological framework that's being used to silence pro-Israel voices. It's a lot.
It is, and it's a deeply concerning situation. But the sources we've explored, they also offer some glimmer of hope. They point to some potential paths forward, ways to address this issue before it's too late.
Okay, well, that's a relief. I
Yeah.
was starting to feel pretty hopeless. So what are these paths forward? What can be done to turn the tide? Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Like, where do we go from here? What can we actually do to combat this rising tide of anti-Semitism?
It's a challenge, for sure. But I think the key takeaway from the sources we've been looking at is that this isn't a hopeless situation.
Okay, so there's a way forward. That's good to hear because I was starting to get a little pessimistic.
Yeah, there are things we can do both as individuals and as a society.
Uh-huh.
And the sources offer some concrete suggestions.
Okay, let's dive into those. Where do we even begin?
I think it starts with acknowledging the problem.
Right.
Admitting that anti-Semitism is a real and growing threat in Canada, and that it needs to be addressed head-on.
No more sweeping it under the rug or pretending it's not that bad.
Exactly, and then we need to look at the systemic factors that might be contributing to this problem. Things like immigration policies, government funding decisions, even foreign policy.
Okay, so you're talking about a kind of multi-pronged approach.
Right, tackling this issue from multiple angles. And the sources offer some specific recommendations in each of those areas.
Let's start with immigration then, because that's a big one, right? Canada prides itself on being a welcoming and multicultural country.
Absolutely, and I think we should continue to welcome newcomers. But the sources suggest that we need to be more proactive about integration.
Proactive how? What does that look like in practice?
Well, it means going beyond just providing basic language training and job search assistance. It means actively fostering a shared understanding of Canadian values, including tolerance and respect for diversity.
And how do we do that?
Well, one idea that comes up in the sources is incorporating cultural sensitivity training into language courses. Another is providing education on Canadian history and the Holocaust, and some even suggest facilitated dialogues between newcomers and established communities.
So basically creating opportunities for meaningful interaction and cross-cultural understanding.
Exactly. It's about building bridges, not just walls.
Makes sense. Okay, what about the issue of government funding? Because we saw how that can backfire when money ends up supporting organizations or individuals with questionable ties.
Yeah, the Laith Marouf case was a real wake-up call in that regard. And the sources suggest that we need stricter vetting processes for funding recipients, making sure that those who receive taxpayer dollars actually align with Canadian values of tolerance and inclusion.
So doing your homework before you hand out the checks. Makes sense.
It's about due diligence and transparency. Canadians deserve to know where their money is going and that it's not being used to support those who promote hatred.
Absolutely.
Right.
Okay, so we've got immigration and funding. What about foreign policy? Because that's a tricky one, right?
It is, and it's an area where Canada needs to tread carefully. The sources suggest that we need to find a way to support a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict while also taking a clear stance against anti-Semitism.
So condemning terrorism, supporting Israel's right to self-defense, but also advocating for Palestinian rights. It's a delicate balance.
It is, but it's a balance that we need to find. Because the sources are pretty clear that any perceived bias against Israel on the part of the Canadian government, it can create a climate where anti-Semitism is more readily accepted at home.
It's like sending the message that it's okay to be hostile towards Israel, and that hostility can easily spill over into anti-Jewish sentiment.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important for Canada to articulate its position carefully, condemning terrorism unequivocally while also supporting a two-state solution and the human rights of both Israelis and Palestinians.
Okay, so we've talked about what the government can do, but what about individuals? What role do we play in all of this?
Well, I think the most important thing is to speak out against anti-Semitism whenever we see it, whether it's a casual joke, a hateful comment online, or an act of discrimination. We need to make it clear that this kind of behavior is not acceptable.
So no more staying silent or looking the other way.
Exactly. Silence is complicity, and we all have a responsibility to challenge hatred and prejudice in all its forms.
And I think education is a big part of this too, right? Because sometimes people might not even realize that they're perpetuating harmful stereotypes or engaging in anti-Semitic behavior.
Absolutely. And the sources highlight the need for better education on anti-Semitism, both in schools and in the wider community, teaching people about the history of anti-Jewish hatred, the different forms it can take, and how to recognize and challenge it.
And it's not just about historical anti-Semitism either, right? It's also about understanding how those ancient prejudices can manifest in modern ways, like through this whole anti-Palestinian racism framework, for example.
Exactly. We need to be able to see through the rhetoric and recognize anti-Semitism, even when it's disguised as something else.
So it's about critical thinking, media literacy, being able to discern fact from fiction and propaganda.
And it's about empathy, too, putting ourselves in the shoes of those who are targeted by hate and understanding the impact it has on their lives.
It's about recognizing that words have power, and that even seemingly harmless jokes or comments can contribute to a climate of intolerance.
And ultimately, it's about creating a society where everyone feels safe and respected, regardless of their background or beliefs. A society where diversity is truly celebrated, and where we all work together to combat hatred and prejudice in all its forms.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but I hope our listeners come away with a sense of hope. That even though we're facing some serious challenges, we can overcome them if we work together.
I agree. This is a fight we can win, but it's a fight that requires all of us to be engaged and informed and willing to speak up for what's right.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, folks. We'll see you next time.